Okay, I think we're going to start. My name is Mzukisi Qobo, the head of Vet School of Governance. I'd like to welcome everyone who has joined us this afternoon on this very important discussion on South Africa's macroeconomic policy, also touching on making some reflections on what's likely to come out of the medium-term budget policy statement. We have a number of experienced scholars and observers on macroeconomic policy, and the chair, Mr. Lumkile Mondi, soon to be doctor, will give us an overview of the different panelists that we have with us. This is the first of a series of papers that we're going to be discussing with the academic community, the business community, the research community, and this first set of papers are going to be delivered by Professor Michael Sachs and Ms. Nombulelo Gumata. They've both produced long reports on South Africa's macroeconomic policy. One takes a historical institutionalist perspective, and the other grapples with the challenges of the day. As we all know, we live in the midst of a health and economic pandemic, and there are no ready-made responses and solutions to this. This is the time when the country's intellectual capital is looked upon to rise to the challenges that face policymakers, and offer insights on how we should shape the outlines of economic policy and how we should rethink the future. Hence, we name the project that we're running South Africa's Future Economy. And I would like to, for this, I would like to thank our partners, Telkom, who we work together with and who support this project to contribute to the country's thinking about how we get ourselves out of this pandemic and how we reconfigure our economy. I also want to give a special thanks to my colleague, Dr. Nomfundo Ngwenya, who has been leading this project and has taken it to the point we're at now, where we are able to present the first set of papers and get some feedback from participants. There are 7 or 8 other papers that we will be presenting, from those that look at state capacity to those that look at the nexus between industrial and competition policy, to those looking at state-owned, reform of state-owned enterprises, and a number of other papers that we will be presenting in this format. And certainly, as a School of Governance, we position ourselves to grapple with public policy and governance challenges of the day. We want to be relevant, over and above the academic programs that we offer at postgrad level, postgrad diploma level, to master's programs, to PhDs. We also want to shape a convening space where we dialogue with policy community, with policy makers, and with a range of other stakeholders in business to find solutions to some of these very intractable challenges in the economy. So with those words, I want to first thank our panelists for taking time and to be with us and to share their insights, but also to welcome all our participants on this webinar. We look forward to your critical questions and comments. Over to you, Lumkile. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Kobo. My name is Lumkele Mondi. I've got an easier job today to get the presenters as well as the respondents going. So I have two presenters. I've got Nombulelo Kumata, who's going to be our first speaker. Nombulelo is an economist and has authored several books in the areas of monetary policy, banking, regulation, international finance and macroeconomics, macroprudential tools, financial stability, labor markets, monetary and fiscal policy. And also after her, I'll have Professor Sachs. Professor Sachs is an adjunct professor at the Southern Center for Inequality, but also a colleague in the School of Economics and Finance at WITS. So allow me to introduce Nombulelo. And Nombulelo, if you're ready, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, you can hear me? You can. Okay. Just to alert you that I have electricity problems. So my internet is very unstable and my laptop battery might just give in. So I would just quickly go into the presentation. What I did in the presentation and the paper that I wrote in a series of papers was to look at how the COVID-19 pandemic shock is going to get us into an even worse position than we were post-2009. So as I let the reader to, or bring the attention of the reader to, is what are the monetary and fiscal policy challenges that are posed by the South Africa's economic crisis, the deepening one, and the COVID-19 pandemic shock. And in the presentation, I also look at what are the implications for the counter-cyclical fiscal policy stance and an investment-led growth, as we all usually talk about. More especially if you look at the trends that I will show later in the presentation of what has been going on in terms of the stylized persistently widening, or you are sharing the screen. Okay, you can go to slide 3. Yeah, that's the slide. Thank you very much. So no, go to the previous one. It's slide 3. So I also asked what does the persistently widening budget deficit alongside a persistently widening output gap and a persistently increasing debt to GDP ratio that also exists alongside an investment to GDP ratio that is widening mean, because these are the trends we've observed post-2009. At the same time, the key variables that underlie the measures of fiscal sustainability, namely R, which would be proxied by the 10-year yield, and nominal GDP or real GDP, if you look at both, which would be G. Or both of them have been going in different directions, and the gap between the two has been widening. So also I note that of importance is that although the inflation, headline inflation has been within the target range and very well in many cases below 4.5, which is the preferred target point range of the SAP, you realize that inflation has been low and stable if you take that, and the price stability mandate has been achieved, but unemployment has gone in the opposite direction. So what does that mean about the current state of the policy mix we've been using? So I asked a very pertinent question, which all of us are grappling with. What have we missed or gotten wrong in the policy mix post-2009? So I think all of us as economists in South Africa have been really grappling with this question, and we are looking at ways of addressing that. So I also say that implied in the last question, which is what have we gotten wrong in the policy mix post-2009, is whether the current policy mix and the policy tools we are using are potent. By potent meaning that we always hear people say that you need to spend more, fiscal policy is sort of your counter-cyclical policy tool to get yourself out of a recession faster. So if you notice that we've been in a deficit position and we've been spending post-2009, which is what, more than 10 years now, and we haven't seen a return of growth, what does that mean about the potent, the deficit spending fiscal policy as a tool? Is it potent enough for us, or we need to do something more? I also look as to whether the outcomes have been what we thought we would get. Because I remember post 2009, all of us thought that, oh no, you can spend, increase your deficit, widen your budget deficit, loosen your monetary policy tools, cut interest rate to almost what the lowest you can. And the combination of those policies would likely, more than likely, get you out of a slump. But we haven't gotten out of that slump. Instead, we've been dealing with a widening output gap and very uneven and weak growth. Unemployment has grown at the same time. Also, I want us to assess whether we think these are the sufficient tools, or they need to be complemented or reinforced, which is the same as being propagated by other more potent policy tools. In a way, what I'm posing to us is to say, if we've tried this for so long and we're still facing the same problems and they're deepening, isn't it time that we look at other tools that can reinforce these effects that we're supposedly going to be resulting? So I also want us to keep in mind as we go through my presentation to say, as much as we've had price stability, as I said, it is important, and we know that all of us know that as a nominal anchor, you need it. But is it also a necessary? Is it a sufficient condition for macroeconomic stability and robust employment growth that leads to a sustained decline in the unemployment rate? So that's a question that we have to put alongside to say we have decided that we are going to go into the inflation targeting regime. It has served us well. We have also managed to bring inflation below 4.5 for most of the time, but does it mean that it's a sufficient condition to take us forward, or we need to supplement it with some form of a relook at the policy framework as we go on? Precisely because with the onset of the financial crisis, we asked the same question. We said, okay, we've been in a global low inflation environment, and all of us were patting ourselves at the back saying that, oh, the devil of inflation has been defeated. And yet in the process of a low inflation, we lost attention on financial stability. And it came out with a bang in 2007, and it made us realize that you might have price stability, but financial stability is not guaranteed. As a result, we relooked at the objectives of policymakers, and we fine-tuned the mandates to also include the financial stability mandate. And as we speak, we know that it's not yet a fully understood mandate, but we are developing those tools and fine-tuning them as we move along. So I also pose in my presentation that we need a different approach to solving the current economic challenges, which are deepening, as we all agree. And at the center of this different approach, I pose that policy coordination is the way to go. So you can go to slide 5. Okay, as I stated earlier, I focus my presentation on R&G, which is where I state clearly that how do we raise G, which is great, which is growth, and make sure that it stabilizes at levels that are consistent with low, stable inflation and a low unemployment rate. So that is the key question that we are all trying to get to, whether we approach it from the investment side of things, whether we approach it from the labor market side of things, whichever way we approach it, all we are trying to get to is to say, how do we get a high level of growth coexisting with low inflation and high level of employment growth? So if you notice as I speak, what I want us to keep in mind is that we always say once we talk about growth, we should think about the role of structural reforms, but we hardly put the exchange rate policy or the exchange rate dynamics at the center of this discussion. And I just want us during this discussion to just pay attention to the fact that the exchange rate, it plays an important role, because if you look at the exports channel, the investment channel, and the consumption, they are all the components of aggregate demand that need to be stimulated, and the exchange rate plays a meaningful role in those in the dynamics of those channels. So also, I know we as economists, we always like to say structural reforms, but we are never clear as to what exactly do we mean about the structural reforms. We will be talking education, we'll be talking this, we'll be talking this. So I also ask, is it a one size fits all for all sectors of the economy? You see? So if I think we can be clear as to what we mean, for instance, for the agricultural sector, what do we mean about structural reforms in relation to the agricultural sector? What do we mean manufacturing, transport, all of those, such that we know exactly what needs to be done. And also what do we mean by policy coordination, especially in relation to fiscal and monetary policy. And we always, when we speak, more especially the commentators in the newspapers, we always forget to put into focus and anchor our debates into what is the role of inflation regimes in terms of the monetary and fiscal policy coordination, more especially when you think about the transmission of these shocks that we are trying to, policy shocks that we are trying to implement. Because all of these nominal demand management policy tools like your inflation, expansionary monetary policy and government spending shocks, they are all inflation regime dependent. So we always have to keep that in mind. So just briefly, I know we all know these dial aspects. As I said here, if you look at the trends that we've been observing, A shows us there that the budget deficit has widened post 2009. So the gray line there in graph 1 just shows us what has happened post 2009. We've used the budget deficit deficit financing tool as we would have been taught in our economics textbooks, that you do that to counter a severe slump. So we've been using it. What are the results? So what I want us to do is to say, we have the deficit that has been consistently widening at 5% of GDP. Are we getting the results that we desired? At the same time, if you go to B, the debt to GDP, the ratio has increased from levels of around 25% and is going upwards. We all know the dynamics around that. And the minister is going to remind us about their new forecast and calibrations tomorrow. But if you go to C and juxtapose it against A and B, you see that nominal GDP growth has been trending downwards. So what have we missed here? Why is it that the budget deficit channel, deficit spending channel is not feeding through to nominal GDP growth? What is going on here? That's why I'm saying that, is this a potent channel of policy that will get us out of this current slump and deepening economic crisis? At the same time, if you look at the unemployment rate, it's been rising post 2009. It's as if you haven't conducted any policy stimulus. You get that? I show it there at E, the output gap has also widened. I show that headline inflation has been the only one that has been mainly by and large achieved, because it has been within the inflation target range. So you can safely say that in the whole setup of the macroeconomic accounts, at least the price stability mandate has been maintained post 2009. And you have to ask why. What are the dynamics going on there? So if you go to figure 2, which is slide 7, no, it's slide 8. So in A there, I try to are very potent. Okay, you can go down. Yeah, that one, that slide. If indeed they are that potent, why is it that you can have the government debt to GDP ratio that is going, the investment to GDP ratio going down? So clearly there's a disconnect there. There's something that just doesn't go right. You are not supposed to have that. At the same time, if you go to B, revenue and expenditure have been widening. So at some point, we are supposed to see the wheels or the channels working, such that you are supposed to see at least expenditure recovering, and we haven't seen that, and spending is still continuing to grow. As I said, the RNG underpinning the sustainability, the fiscal sustainability accounts. If you go to C, If we look at it versus nominal GDP growth, nominal GDP growth has trended down. Meanwhile, the 10-year yield has tended to stabilize around your 7-10% range. So what you are seeing there, you are seeing that widening gap between the R and the G. So what is going on here? Because you are not supposed to have this if you have so much stimulus in the economy. If you go to F, I show that the government interest cost is rising, which is exactly the outcome of what? Of spending and an increase in the yield. Okay, we can go to figure 3, which is the last in the stylized facts. So I think also, because normally when we talk, more especially with the with the fiscals, we always tend to misinform people to say, no, there's austerity, there's no spending, there's no that. So I just wanted us to all be on the same page when we start with this. Let's look at the data and let us not create our own facts. If you go to A, government debt has been growing at above 10%, that dotted line there. So if the growth rate in the debt of government has been above 10%, clearly government has been issuing debt, you see. And if you look at the period post-2009, this is an exception if you post-2000. In 2000, between 2000 and 2008, let's say for argument's sake, you haven't had debt growing that much in terms of government debt. It's been below 10%. And that has been the best period where we had stable growth and we had unemployment go down. So again, I want us, when we discuss the role of the fiscus and the government debt channel as a stimulus, to juxtapose it against the fact that you've had so much debt issued by government, and yet you haven't seen any meaningful growth. So again, is debt growth by government a potent tool to use in this crisis? So also, because the presentation I do also touches on the issues of household spending and what's this, the debt scheme, the government debt scheme, I show there in B, C, D, E, F. So in B, just roughly to just put into context, is the monetary policy cycles. Granted, the trend of the repo rate has been downwards trending. We can see that we started around your 18%, we are now around 3%. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that if you look at the 2000s, that was the longest downward phase of the repo rate, which would equate to a monetary policy easing. And if you look in A, it coincided with a very low level of government debt growth, you see? And if you go to your accounts in terms of GDP, unemployment, and all of that, macroeconomic accounts, that was the best performance we had in terms of growth and unemployment as a country. So if you go again, post-crisis, the cycles are getting shorter, although the trend is going down. So we are now in the cycle that has started now before the pandemic. We don't know how far the repo rate will go in terms of downward movements, and also we don't know how long the accommodative cycle will last. So what I'm trying to bring to the attention of the reader here is that as much as we are having the downward trend in the repo rate and these accommodative cycles, you shouldn't forget that that is not the only factor that influences lending and supporting demand in the country, precisely because now with the COVID-19 pandemic, you have the problem of non-performing loans, which is going to just neutralize highly the effects of a low repo rate. So if you go to a non-performing loan, since 2018, we are approaching what as a ratio of the total credit extended by banks is going up. So now you are having that risk element that is going to kick in, where you are not going to see the same back you would have seen in other monetary policy cycles, easing cycles. So we might see the repo rate go down or stay down longer, but we shouldn't be surprised to see why it's not as stimulative as we expected it to be, because there are these other factors that we're not taking into account that are neutralizing the effects, because we're not going to see as much lending as we thought we could see. Also, if you look at the lending rate repo rate margin, it hasn't slowed down. Even if the repo rate is declining, banks are pricing risk, and you're not seeing the very same narrowing in terms of the lending rate spread, precisely because they're also managing risks. So that we should contain our expectations. Hence, I say, let's look at what other channels we can work on. So I also showed there the loan intermediation markup and the interest rate pass-through, which are exactly the same issues that in an atmosphere where banks are experiencing an increase in non-performing loans, they are highly unlikely to pass through the full effects of the repo rate. So you're going to see a very, very constrained level of pass-through of the repo rate changes. At the same time, the loan intermediation markup is going to go up. So we are sitting with that problem. We can go to the next slide. So I say that, okay, we can go to the next slide. It's a question I've already posed. Okay, so now I just repeat what the known facts. The debt to GDP ratio is expected to peak at 8.7%, which is the high in historical terms. Also, we are expecting that the budget deficit is going to widen further at 15.7%. And the negative output gap is going to widen to 7% and remain negative. So we are going to be in this state up until 2022 if we go by the forecast, you see. So now let us not say we don't know what needs to be done in 2020, because already the forecasts are telling us that by 2022, we won't have closed the gap despite a widening budget deficit, despite an increasing 8.7, an increasing debt to GDP ratio. So what do we need to do? Because for us to know that the policy settings we are using and the policy mix that we are using is working, we need to actively see that the output gap is closing. And where are we going to see that? We are going to see that in nominal GDP. We are going to see that in employment growth. We are going to see that in GDP growth. So now what I'm saying here is that what are we really saying now? Because we have this counter-cyclical policy stance, which is very accommodative, which is likely to go on up until 2022, and is going to live side by side with a very, very accommodative monetary policy tool. You see, we've already had that post 2002. So what do we still believe that the budget balance as a ratio of nominal GDP and a widening output gap and increasing unemployment, that doesn't tell us something about the fiscal multipliers? So do we really believe that the fiscal multipliers that we are going to get out of this widening budget deficit and increasing in spending is going to change all of a sudden? So that is the question I pose. So what I drive the conclusion of, because the paper didn't go to the fiscal multipliers, but we've done work on this, is to show that clearly it tells you that that is not the potent channel that you can use to stimulate growth. Precisely because what it tells us that these two policy mix that we have been dominantly using have not been potent as initially thought, because we have not been successful to close the output gap and get us out of the slump that we have been in. Investment is dead and the unemployment rate is going up. So let us rethink what other policy tools we need to have. So I argue there that there is therefore a case to explore a wider range of potent policy tools and interventions that will propagate the effects of these current policy tools. So now I stated earlier in my introduction that you cannot speak about fiscal and monetary policy coordination without bringing in the objective function of monetary policy, which enters the debate via the Phillips curve. So all of us know that the Phillips curve, which captures the output gap and inflation relationship, has been flat post 2009, precisely because you've had this output gap that has been widening and inflation has been coming down. So the relationship has almost died down. So the output gap doesn't tell you much about what inflation is likely to do, you see? But what also a Phillips curve tells you is that the policymakers, especially the monetary policymakers, don't have to worry much about the weight they allocate to inflation, precisely because inflation is likely not to be a problem, you see? So they can pay attention to a full employment mandate and aggressively try to address the output side of their objective function, precisely because inflation is highly unlikely to break out, you see? However, we know all of us, we know that normally these relationships are not constant, they are dynamic. So what is the key role that will make sure that inflation is stable and is maintained below 4.5 as is currently preferred by the policymakers? You have to anchor inflation expectations. I know that is the most abused that is the most abused term, but well-anchored inflation expectations, we don't just mean anywhere between 3 and 6, but we mean well-anchored below 4.5 and preferably below that level. What they help you is that they make sure that the output costs of minimizing those inflation outbreaks don't fall on output. So you minimize those disinflation costs and your sacrifice ratios. So the standard understanding that we have to have when we go to the monetary fiscal policy coordination is that we cannot miss out the role of inflation, and we cannot miss out the role of inflation expectations. So again, there I just emphasize, sorry?
You've got 2 minutes, Bully.
Oh my goodness, let me rush. So I've spoken a lot. Let me try and prioritize here. Let me go down. Okay, so now I come here and show that why would we care about inflation being within that inflation target range? It's precisely because it's all about credibility. So if you go now, if you go to the period post 2009, just to check the differences between low and high credibility, you can see that inflation, the inflation targeting regime has managed to maintain credibility. Also, I showed there in that scatter plot, in that graph, that we cannot run away from the fact that there's a negative relationship between inflation and output growth, whether you look at it from the correlations or the cross correlations or the impulse responses. If inflation goes up, it tends to dampen growth. So how do we raise growth? For the agricultural sector, I had shown there that what the importance is that we need to, if you go to A there, we have seen a systematic downward average growth of gross value added by the agricultural sector. Similarly, we have seen that the investment in the agricultural sector has come down, and yet we are targeting what, at least 1 million jobs in the agricultural sector. So how do we do that? So in this slide, I show that we need to implement accelerated land reform, redistribution, and increase the hectares planted. So when we talk about the agricultural sector, we should be clear as to the fact that what we mean about structural reforms in terms of that sector. Those are the structural reforms. I'm very sorry, I have to rush now. For the mining sector, here I was posing to say, what is the problem we're trying to solve with the mining sector? I say that the mining sector it contributes a lot to export earnings. And yet, if you look at 7-8 there, the contribution to GDP has been systematically low. So what is the problem there? So what I say there in the next slide is that the mining sector is export driven, but contributes very limited to growth. What it simply means is that we need to come up with strategies that are aimed at investing in value chains and commodity sectors and managing the commodity slumps. The manufacturing sector is the same there. The manufacturing sector, if you look at B, I show that the employment in the manufacturing sector has been on a secular decline. But if you look at the gray shaded areas, the only period that we have in historical records post-2000 that has been having employment growth in the manufacturing sector also turned out to be one of the low unemployment rates. And we had the labor market participation and labor absorption rates going up. So what you need to do is to also bring back the manufacturing sector, precisely that, because on the bilateral basis, it contributes 71% of, or it explains 71% of the variation in GDP and 41% of the variation in employment growth. So I say a whole lot of things about the role of the exchange rate, the contractionary effects of large exchange rate depreciations, which we hardly talk about, and that we need to place agency on the efforts to identify an exchange rate policy and a strategy of dealing with the severe effects of the exchange rate depreciation and volatility. Also, we need to stabilize the electricity price inflation below 6%. It's a coincidence that I don't even have electricity as you speak. So also, we also have to deal with the competition policy and measure and remedies to preserve a competitive environment. So I would not get into too much about the issue of R. Basically, one of the issues that we can be using here, as I stated earlier in those graphs that I showed about non-performing loans, your pass-through, interest rate pass-through, is that we have a problem of asymmetric adjustment of lending rates to changes in the repo rate. We need to moderate the yield curve to create conditions that also result in a substitution of funding sources of banks. Also, we need to lower the cost of fundings of banks so that we can deal with the issues of non-performing loans. It so happens also that these effects also will help us in dampening the effects of high test costs on the fiscals. So what I want to bring your attention to is that, how do we do these things? So I go into a detail which I can't do. I have no liberty because of time, of the use of the central bank balance sheet. So I think in the discussions we can go through that. So if I can just conclude here, what I've been trying to say for the past 20 minutes is that the best policy approach, according to the paper that I presented, was that lower the inflation target range of the Reserve Bank to 4 to 5 to 2% to make clear what we mean by low and stable inflation, quantitatively speaking, so that we know, all of us, that you're targeting inflation to be between 4 and 2, expand the mandate of the Reserve Bank to include maximum employment and growth objective. Having done that, allow the Reserve Bank to approach this maximum employment objective pragmatically. Also, give the latitude to use the entirety of his balance sheet where necessary, create new tools to achieve these objectives. Identify an exchange rate policy strategy, facilitate for greater coordination between fiscal and monetary policy, then implement the structural reforms, knowing that it's not a one-size-fits-all. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nombulelo. It's very interesting. I'm sorry I had
Yes.
to cut you, given that I have got limited time.
Yes, I understand.
So for some of you who want to pose some questions to speakers as well as the respondents, please use the Q&A facility that you have here at the bottom. My next speaker is Professor Michael Sachs, who is the adjunct professor at the school, at the Southern Center for Inequality, as well as a lecturer at the School of Economics and Finance. Professor Sachs, I hope you're ready. Now your turn.
I am ready. Let me just share the screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I think I agree with almost, with let me say 70% of what Nombulelo has presented. And in particular, I agree, and I think it's the basic point in my presentation, in fact, that debt, the dynamics of debt, are driven by 3 variables. The first is the interest rate that government pays on its debt. The second is the rate of economic growth. And the third is the primary balance, which is like the deficit excluding debt service costs. which is the government deficit for those who are less schooled in these things. It's a certain kind of government deficit. Now, the first two of those variables, which in the profession we will call R and G, are determined largely by global conditions. The rate of South Africa's economic growth and its interest rates are largely determined by global conditions. The last variable, the primary balance, is politically determined. The primary surplus that a government can run is dependent on political factors, because running this primary surplus implies imposing large taxes on the affluent sectors of the population and or reducing expenditure, which is a large part of the consumption basket of the poor. So those are political acts. So my basic argument is that in the current conditions where the interest rate is above the growth rate, the primary balance that is needed to stabilize debt in those conditions is unattainable for political reasons. And therefore, South Africa faces an almost certain debt crisis. And it's a crisis that's going to define policymaking, in my view, for the next 5 years to 10 years. And it is a crisis that's going to lead to large shifts in the structure of South Africa's budget and perhaps in the distribution of wealth within South Africa. So let me kind of now go back and go a little bit more into the presentation and justify these arguments. So the first thing is to look at what is why do we find ourselves in this position of fiscal crisis? And my answer to that question, there's a narrative that we're in fiscal crisis because fiscal policy has been out of control. Public sector wages have been growing out of control. There's this indiscipline. We have an incontinent government that is unable to discipline itself, and therefore we're in fiscal crisis. And I think that is wrong. And the reason is given in this graph, which shows core government spending since 1996. We like to discuss, many people like to discuss gear a lot, and you can see the impact of gear in the small reduction of expenditure in the 90s. But really the dominant fact of the last 30 years of fiscal policy making is the increase, the permanent increase in fiscal commitments that were made between around the year 2002 and the year 2012. There were 4 elements of those commitments. The first was a large expansion of core government services. And when I say core government services, I mean health, basic education, and the police, who between them account for about 75% of government's wage bill. So the numbers employed, all of those services are fundamentally labor intensive. So if you want to expand education, it necessarily implies that you must expand the employment of teachers. So the first thing that happened over that period was a large expansion in employment of teachers, nurses, police officers, and staff to support those sectors. The second element was a large and substantial improvement of the conditions of service, the remuneration of public servants. So over that period, public service, the average public servant got pay increases of about 5%, higher than inflation over this period of expansion. Since then, wage growth in the public service has been very moderate. The third element of this expansion was a large expansion in transfers to the poor in several forms. We all know about social grants, but you also had the introduction of free basic services, water and electricity, and several others. Now, the last point, okay, and then there's a fourth element, which I'm going to come to next, which is infrastructure spending. But before I come to that on the next slide, I want to show you that over the last decade, expenditure as a share of GDP has not increased until this blip at the end. What is that blip at the end? It's two things. One, it's the collapse of economic growth, which has driven down GDP relative to the numerator. And two, it's the introduction of free basic education, free university education, fee-free university education. So again, I suppose the point here is that fiscal policy is not really driven by cyclical concerns. Democracy mandated a large expansion of government services between 2002 and 2012 as permanent fiscal commitments. We also tried at the same time to accelerate the rate of economic growth, and we did that through a surge in infrastructure spending. So this graph shows you, it divides infrastructure spending into two parts. The bars reflect the part of capital spending that is financed by the fiscus. That is the spending in national and provincial departments, local government, universities to an extent, and extra budgetary funds, which is like your PRASA, SANRAL, and water utilities. So those bars are all financed on budget. The line is what is leveraged off the balance sheet of state-owned companies. So the point I want to make here is that, again, in this period between 2004, let's say, and 2012, you had an historic surge in public infrastructure investment. It peaked in 2010 around the time of the World Cup and then fell back. But at least as far as budget allocations are concerned, infrastructure investment continued to improve up until about 2016. And the same is true of state-owned companies. And this line is driven almost entirely by Transnet and Eskom. But both Transnet and Eskom began to retreat from their infrastructure programs after 2015. And I'll come back to the reasons for that. But why? So what we have is a massive surge in fiscal commitments, an improvement in remuneration of public servants, more health, education, and police spending, more transfers to the poor, and a surge in capital spending. And at the height of all of this, growth collapsed. So that history doesn't mean that growth will collapse again if we engage in a surge of spending, but it does caution us that simply because you increase spending, it doesn't mean that growth will increase, because we did that before and it didn't work. Why did growth collapse? Fundamentally because global conditions changed. So this graph shows you an indicator of South Africa's, the real dollar value of South Africa's commodity exports since over the last 120 years. So at the beginning of this time series in 1900, our export basket was dominated almost exclusively by gold. And this dotted line here shows you the gold price index. The darker line, the black line, shows you it's a basket of our current exports. So it's a basket that includes platinum, gold, coal, iron ore, and others. But you can see that over whichever one you use, since 1970, South Africa's growth has been driven by three large swings in the commodity price, in the price of our commodity exports. The first leading up to 1980, and then there was a decline up to 2000, and then another boom between 2000 and 2011 or so, and then a decline after that. So if you want to see how significant that this is for South Africa's growth prospects, we can compare South Africa's growth to its peers, other countries that also export the same commodities as South Africa. And that's what I've done here. The dotted line is world growth, the growth of the world economy. And you can see that before 2010, South Africa, which is the black line, followed the world economy very directly. But after about 2011, South Africa diverges. And usually people think that this is because of domestic factors, Eskom or state capture and corruption, but I don't think so. I think the fundamental shift in South Africa's growth was a global shift. By the way, I should say that commodity prices are just one indicator of these global impacts on South African growth. One can also look at global financing conditions, and you will observe that in the 1970s, global financing conditions were very easy. But then after the Reagan administration came to power in 1980, global interest rates shot up, causing a debt crisis in the developing world. So these shifts in global commodity prices and global financing conditions, I argue, is the fundamental determinant of R and G in South Africa. Or is an important, let me say, is an important determinant. There are others, of course. So what have we been doing over the last 10 years? And why haven't we been stabilizing the fiscus? The first point to realize is that although growth was decelerating between 2012 and 2016, growth was decelerating year after year, but tax revenue was not. And this poses a conundrum. And in the paper, I identify 3 elements that explain why revenue continued to grow. Because while revenue was growing faster than GDP, it appeared that South Africa was on track to a fiscal consolidation and a stabilization of its debt level. What were the reasons? The reasons were, 1, affluent although growth was decelerating and unemployment was rising, affluent South Africans continued to maintain growth in their earnings, far above the rest of the population, by the way, far above public servants. And as a result of that, because the affluent are the ones that pay taxes, taxes surged. Secondly, there were policy interventions. And the most significant policy intervention was with fiscal drag. So during the commodity boom, South Africa eased taxes quite significantly. Then after the commodity boom, South Africa raised taxes quite significantly. So what you have is, if you see these categorizations of taxes, a huge fall in taxes on capital, essentially, a rise in taxes on consumption, which are particularly regressive, and this historic shift up in personal income tax. And that all came to an end in 2016. And I don't believe that the collapse in tax revenue after 2016 had very much to do with Tom Moyane or state capture and such things. I think it's entirely explainable in terms of underlying macroeconomic conditions. So in 2016, what happened was that growth collapsed even further. It had been decelerating since 2012 or 2011, but now growth collapsed again. And this time, it's not really a global phenomenon. It's almost entirely a domestic phenomenon. And there are 3 reasons why growth collapsed in that period. The first was a collapse in export volumes, which was quite small, but nevertheless significant at the time. The second was a tightening in macroeconomic policy. So both fiscal policy and monetary policy in that period tightened considerably. So fiscal policy, the growth rate of expenditure dropped significantly, and you actually had a government consumption contracted in 2015. At the same time, the repo rate was raised by 1%. So that's the second factor, was a macroeconomic tightening. The third and overwhelmingly most important factor was a collapse in investment. And this collapse was led by the private sector. It started in mining, but then it became much broader. And I'm talking about the fall. So up until then, investment had appeared to be growing, but then it collapsed. And then following the collapse of private investment, public investment also collapsed. And I won't go into the reasons for that, but I think public investment had to collapse because the investments that were being made were fundamentally uneconomic. And I go into this in the paper, but I won't go into it now. So the next slide is then beginning to ask, and I think that's one area where maybe I differ a bit with Nombulelo, to ask, is there austerity? And what I say is that there was no consolidation of the budget position. As the expenditure was contained, debt continued to rise. And as a result, debt service costs reversed the gains of consolidation that had been achieved by limiting social spending. So we're containing social spending, imposing conditions of austerity on frontline service delivery departments, but interest payments are rising so fast that you're not closing the deficit. And I'm calling this austerity without consolidation. And I just want to draw your attention to some of the numbers here. So first of all, we've got national and provincial departments of government. And you can see here, this line is showing interest payments. That is what is out of control. Compensation of employees is not out of control for the last decade. In fact, compensation of employees is almost flat, right? It begins to rise at the end again because growth slows significantly. What is forced down in order to accommodate this fiscal position is, first of all, capital spending, especially after 2016, when the fiscal constraint tightened and fee-free university education was introduced. And you can see the impact on universities from this line here, which shows transfers to higher education institutions. But secondly, goods and services. So national departments today spend the same in goods and services as a share of GDP than they did a decade ago. So you had massive downward pressure on goods and services also to achieve this consolidation. Now, the combination of these factors, lower capital spending, downward pressure on goods and services, and compensation budgets that were held flat while public servants received moderate gains in their pay, the last factor led to a fall in the number of teachers, nurses, and police officers that we employ. So a lot of the gains that were made in service delivery in the period between 2002 and 2012 were eroded and reversed in this period. So you have rising class sizes. The size of classes has been rising for a decade, and that effect is particularly pronounced in the poorest provinces. You also have a fundamental erosion of the public infrastructure assets that those services use. And relative to the population, the numbers of nurses and police officers and doctors that we have has been falling. So on the other hand, 3 minutes, right?
4 minutes, four.
I'll
4
try.
minutes,
Four.
4 minutes.
Let me say 5. I mean, let me push it.
5, I'll give you 5. I'll give you 5.
On the other hand, it's not true that all government expenditure is not growing. And on the right-hand side, you see that while local government also had a collapse in capital spending, its compensation budgets and its goods and services budgets continue to grow. But that has very little to do directly with the deficit, because they are largely, these things, at least in the metros, are largely financed from other revenue sources. So I'll skip over this one, but just tell you what it shows is a massive and historically unprecedented collapse in the efficiency of public investment, or of investment in general, but public investment in particular. So while we had this infrastructure surge on the one hand, the issue is not the money you spend. The issue is, do you create assets that drive economic growth and capital accumulation? That's the question. So you can show that we've increased infrastructure spending, which is what I was showing you before, but the assets that were being created were a drag on productivity, like Medupi and Kusile, for example. But another example is given by PRASA. And I'm sure all of us have been reading about what's happened to PRASA's infrastructure over the last decade. It's been wasted away. But this graph shows you the value of transfers from the fiscus out of taxation, diverting resources from these social services that are under pressure to PRASA. So PRASA over the last decade has received 100 billion rand in capital subsidies, effectively money down the drain, because the capital that it is supposed to have subsidized has been wasted away. So this is kind of the last part of what I'm saying. And that is that I do not believe that the consolidation that is proposed in the special adjustment budget is possible. I don't think it's desirable, but I also don't think it's possible. And to just indicate the size of this consolidation, this just shows you the black line is the nominal growth in non-interest expenditure. So all the expenditure of government, excluding interest payments, everything we spend on goods and services and salaries and hospitals and clinics and police stations is in that line. And how fast does it grow year after year? And of course, we're interested in comparing that to consumer price inflation, because that's if it grows faster than consumer price inflation, it's growing in real terms. And the last time when we contracted the fiscus, as I mentioned, and you had a real contraction in government consumption expenditure, there was a massive blow to growth, and that was in 2016. What is proposed in the special adjustment budget is a minus 4.6% contraction in nominal expenditure. This is, I mean, it's simply not possible. It's certainly not possible to do without massively eroding the value of education, health, and policing services, which make up most of the budget. Because even if government succeeds in freezing wages and the salary component of the budget remains constant, doesn't grow by a single % in nominal terms next year, you will still have to cut spending by 100 billion rand by next year to achieve this target. What is 100 billion rand? Well, the whole capital budget of national and provincial government is 50 billion rand. Right? So you could cut the whole capital budget, you would still be left with another 50 billion rand to find. And as I've shown you, capital budgets and goods and services budgets have been under massive pressure. Transfers like social grants, I assume, are not on the table. And once you've spoken about capital, transfers, salaries, and goods and services, that's the whole budget, right? So that's the first reason why I don't think it's possible. And what I'm saying there is I don't think that government has the political capacity to impose such a large shock on society. And I don't expect it to do so. But the second reason why it's impossible, and this is what Nombulelo was talking about, is the relationship between growth and the interest rate. And she made mention of the bond yield. And this dashed line gives you an idea of the 10-year bond yield. It's a trend that has been smoothed. But the important thing for government and for debt sustainability is not the bond yield, but the effective interest rate on government debt, which is a slightly different thing. But that has declined quite substantially over the last decade, mainly driven again by global conditions. It has very little to do with domestic monetary policy. But the really shocking thing about this graph is that nominal GDP growth, as Nombulelo was telling us, has fallen far below the effective interest rate on government debt. And so there is no amount of fiscal consolidation that will stabilize the debt if growth doesn't return, essentially. So, I won't go through any further slides, but just conclude by saying that therefore we have to raise the rate of growth. And if we have this massive contraction next year, we're not going to raise the rate of growth. So the question, the policy conclusion is that if we don't raise the rate of growth substantially in the next 2 or 3 years, we will face a debt crisis in this country. And it will lead to a lot of serious macroeconomic disturbance of a kind that I think that South Africa has never seen in its history. And that is what I'm expecting to see over the next 3 to 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachs and Nombulelo Kumata. It's been wonderful to listen to the work that you've done. Colleagues, both papers presented by Professor Sachs and Nombulelo Kumata are being presented here in this workshop for validation. So we welcome the input. So please use the Q&A facility that you have. Of course, these papers, following your input, will be integrated and therefore be put on the website in the following week. At the moment, we'll share the PPT or the PowerPoint presentations with you. So having said that, I'm going to move now to the respondent. My first respondent is going to be Duma Qubule. Duma Qubule is the founder of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, a Waterford Kamhlaba graduate with a master's in economics from Aberdeen University in Scotland, has worked extensively with President Ramaphosa in the Black Economic Empowerment Commission when President Ramaphosa chaired it, but also is an author of a book which he edited called Making Mistakes, Righting Wrongs, Insight into BE, and is currently also, in addition to other things that he does, he's a columnist for Business Day. So Mr. Qubule, it's over to you to respond to the two papers. Thank you.
It's nice to have Duma on mute.
He's on
But,
mute.
I think it defeats the purpose.
Sorry, I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to be a discussant here. And I just want to say that I haven't actually slept very well last night, and I'm a bit less animated than I would be normally. I slept very late last night and woke up very early for various reasons. Yeah. But anyway, so I just want to start with what I agree with Mike, because I've been doing some work with COSATU on the wage bill. And I think South Africans do not appreciate the level of skills that are in the public sector. And there's this random statistic that sort of blew my mind. First of all, people don't understand that let's say in health, and Mike will be aware of these figures, about 70% of the workers in the health sector, if I remember well, are quite highly skilled people, yeah. And then I looked at the numbers for the doctors. So there's about just under 5,000 medical specialists, and I think about 16,000 medical practitioners. And these people earn on average more than R1 million. And they, how can I put it? They account for 10% of the entire wage bill. So I found that quite interesting to find out here as I was doing the analysis. So I just want to say on the, and I agree with Mike on the compensation story. So if you look and you talk to union leaders, they will say, no, it is Mike Sachs and them at Treasury who came with this occupation-specific dispensation. It wasn't our initiatives. People were leaving, skilled people were leaving to the private sector, and the nurses were leaving to overseas and to the private sector. So they had to improve the competitiveness of these salaries. And so between 2009 and 2011, I don't have the figures in front of me, and there was a spike in terms of the what you call it, the ratio between the wage bill and compensation. So since then, as Mike correctly says, it has been stagnant between 2011 and 2019. And then in the last budget, medium-term budget statement, you will see that they have figures from the QES. They say, Mike correctly says it was moderate. So you will see that I think the difference between public and private sector wage increases is about 0.8% percentage points over the than 8 or 9 years. I can't remember the figure. And you see it there in the thing. So I don't think that has been the reason for the increase in the debt ratio. And then there's another graph you see in the same medium-term budget statement where they say between 2000, so all the statistics that they use, they conveniently include the adjustments, the one-off adjustment of the wage bill between 2009 2011. But now they count from 2016 to 2007, 2006-7 to 2019. So they show that the debt ratio, the percentage increase that was due to increased wages and real above inflation wages, I think it's 150 billion. And if you look at the increase in the debt over the same period, I think it's, so it's about 7% of the total increase in the debt. It's just that I don't have the numbers now. So that's the first thing I want to say. And then the second thing, there was something else that Mike said that I agree with, which I can't remember what it is. I think it's to do with the infrastructure. I'm just looking at my notes. Now I'll remember later on. I can't remember what it is. So now back to the issues that I'd just like to thank Mike and Nomulela for fantastic presentations and that got us to think about current issues that are facing our country. So the first thing that I wasn't sure about is that the RG and RG and the primary balance. So now let's talk the primary balance. So the primary balance over the period of the debt increasing has been rather low. So that's the second thing. I think that, so what's happening is that government is borrowing, I think, to pay off debt, to pay off the interest costs. So it's not necessarily, so I don't know, that's what I think is going on. Now on the G, being dependent, sorry, it's R versus G. So if for G to be dependent on the growth rate of international factors, I'm not sure about that. So now I'll start there. So now let's start in 2000, the previous crisis, the previous boom. So between October to, hang on, I must get the numbers right. Between March 2003 and December 2008, we created 3.1 million jobs, okay? And the economy grew by just under 5% a year between 2004 and 2008, yeah. So we created 3 point. Now, the only sectors that did not create jobs was mining and agriculture. Across the economy, jobs were created. So in my previous life, I did a lot of work on mining, and I was quite amazed that when you look at the boom period, so this is where I kind of differ with Mike. When you look at the boom period, every single presentation from the Mining Council, whatever it's called now, the Minerals Council, showed that South Africa did not benefit from this boom. So if you look at the mining GDP declined over this period, if you look at investment contribution, it spiked in 2006, if I remember well, but it spiked at about 8% of total investment. So I don't think, and then I looked at a number of statistics in that period, and I concluded that it wasn't really driven by the commodity crisis, and I don't have all the numbers in front of me. So I thought it was a domestically driven boom, but I didn't do what Mike did to extend the analysis to 2011. So I will do that at some point. So what happened, the way I understand it, is that there was a sharp decrease in interest rates, and by about 650 basis points, I think until, was it June 2003? And those of you who are around, you will remember, it was started as a consumption boom, then it became a property boom, and then it became an investment boom after the end of gear. Now, if you look at there were double-digit increases in gross fixed capital formation, and it was driven by public sector investment. Now, the figures for public sector investment, I don't have them in front of me, but they were like close to 20% a year in most of that period. So I do think that it was largely a domestically driven, that's what I think, the boom period, but I'm open to, yeah. So the second thing, now let's look at the second period that Nomulela, she's smiling, that she was talking about. So now I've identified two sub-periods in the last decade, and it's very important that we analyze this last decade because that will inform what we do going forward. So what I'm trying to say is that there were expansionary monetary and fiscal policies during the first period, during the boom period. And then now let's look at the last decade. So now the last decade, there was a counter-cyclical response to the global financial crisis in 2009. So they say that government spending is sticky. It can't just adjust to a collapse of collapse of the foreign economy. So the budget deficit in 2009 went from, if I remember well, a small surplus to about 6% of GDP. That's what happened. And then you look at 2010 to 2013. Government consumption spending was still quite, it was, I don't know what the word is. It was moderate, it wasn't robust, I don't know, something less than robust, but it was moderate increases in government consumption spending, about 3% a year. And then there was public sector investment held up pretty well during that first period. And then guess what happens? GDP growth is about 2.8% during the 2010 to 2013. And then, yeah, so that's what I saw when I was looking at the numbers. So there was also a tax surplus of 30 billion rand during that period. So what happens is obviously there was a collapse, and this is where I agree with Mike, in trend growth rate from about 2014. Now he says 2016, we can look at the same numbers and come to different conclusions. So there was a collapse in the second period, the way I understand it. Public sector investment between 2015 and 2019, but general government was down 18%, if I remember well. By state-owned enterprises, 27%, and public investment in total was down 18%. And government consumption spending collapsed from 3% in the earlier periods to about 1%. So now if you see from the Budget Justice Coalition, they show that over that period, most of the years had a decline in real per capita non-interest expenditure growth. Yeah, so that's what they show in that period. So now, it's, I don't know whether to call it austerity, or I like the word that Mike used, expenditure, was it containment? Yeah, so expenditure was contained during the second period. And guess what happens? The trend growth rate collapses. And then the second thing that happens is that there was a shortfall in tax revenue of about 250 billion rand. So it is during the second period when we start missing our revenue periods every single year by huge amounts. Yeah. So that's, now in terms of the way forward, I just want us to discuss certain issues. The role of the central bank, and I agree with what Nombulelo was saying about we have to change this mandate. I've got big problems, but I wouldn't agree with you on bringing it down to 4.5% and 3.3, I don't know. So we have to have an employment mandate in the current why the central bank can't create the money to become part of the response to the crisis. Because I think the UNCTAD report was saying, we will never see, we've had a collapse in demand and we will never see these conditions again, whereby there is zero inflationary threat in the economy for us to create new, what Stephanie Kelton calls, what did you call it? Our public, no, I forget, there's a name she uses, which I really like. Yeah, so that's number one. Number two, we've got these Forex reserves, I think about somewhere between 900 billion and 1 trillion. Many countries have tapped into their Forex reserves to finance stimulus, and that is definitely a possibility because these reserves are almost 1 year of projected imports for this year. You know, imports will come down. And I don't see why we can't use that, number two. Number three, the restructuring of the SA Inc. balance sheet. Now, I've been talking about this for a long time, and people don't get it, and I have very little time to explain it. But the level of funding in our public sector investment corporation is way too high for a country with such high levels of poverty and inequality. The majority of public sector, and I work with unions, and I tell them this, that the majority of public sector pension funds everywhere in the world are not funded or partially funded. So I don't see any reason why we can't reduce the funding to, it's a complex discussion and I can't go into it now, but I don't see why we can't reduce the level of funding to 50%, and Mike will be aware of these figures. So we've been having a surplus of revenue over expenditure for the past 8-9 years of about 50 billion rands in this fund. It's just accumulating capital upon itself. And then if we reduce the funding to 50%, we still have a surplus of about 15 billion rands. That's number two. So what I'm trying to say is that if we look at the whole SA Inc. balance sheet, and we look at the central bank balance sheet, we can come up with a way to fund this way out of this crisis. And then the third issue that, there's been a whole debate around prescribed assets, and it's sort of disappeared. It was in every single document at NEDLAC, from the government, from the ANC, leading up to this, and then it miraculously disappeared. There was a compromise position which is called changing Regulation 28 and don't. But now it has just disappeared. But now if we find a way to channel some of, through an investment accord, some of this capital, 10 trillion rands, towards developmental or impact investments. And quite frankly, I think we should put a minimum target as opposed to this Regulation 28 situation, which will just be a weak obligation, like it will be appealing to them. So I think we can have a combination of an accord with the industry and a minimum target, or we can settle somewhere. So those are the three things I would like to put on the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Toma. Gina, are you ready so that we can allow others from the participants to also engage with these issues? Gina, next.
I am ready. Thank you for having me today. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to all of you. And I will keep it as brief as possible. I think we've addressed a lot of fiscal issues at the moment. Everything I hear, though, about whether we want to discuss alternative type of instruments on fiscal policy, monetary policy, the balance sheet, I think, the one thing that makes anything workable is credibility, of course, and Michael spoke about that when he spoke about how R&G is obviously very much globally driven. I'd also argue it's locally driven, but the primary balance is very much political. So, when it comes to deciding what to do that's new, the less orthodox policy South Africa could take, you can do that. You've just got to make sure that you're credible. And here we are 3 months after the last budget, and we still don't know if the next consecutive budget will keep the same fiscal strategy. And this is the problem we've had for many years. Every budget we get to is the next big budget. And this is the budget that's going to actually explain what the fiscal strategy is going forward. And every time we get there, we actually find out, no, maybe it's the next one. So maybe just a couple of comments from my side. And thank you for the presentations. Very, very useful. Nombulelo, on inflation. Absolutely, I do agree with you. You need inflation expectations particularly to be anchored, especially at the midpoint for now, given the inflation rate of 4.5%. But do you not think they have to be anchored for a little bit longer? I mean, they have been there for a while, but we need them to be anchored there for longer to ensure that there is spillover of these inflation expectations to the very items that remain over-inflationary. As you rightly pointed out, electricity tariffs are one example there. But administered prices, and yes, we've had a long discussion about the public sector wage bill, and I don't think anyone would advocate for an economy that's going to feel the pain of overly aggressive expenditure reduction. And I don't think anyone's really pushing for headcount cuts in the public sector, given the economic devastation and job loss we've already seen. But public sector wages can, of course, simply fall in line with inflation. And I think that would at least help to show some progress there. CPI is low, of course it's low, but that's also a function of a 10-year, almost 10-year negative output gap. It's a function of weaker demand. It's a function this year very much of that crash in commodity prices, the oil price being obviously the biggest one for South Africa. So while I believe inflation will remain low, and the SARB believes it'll be at 4.5%, perhaps we need to see it there a little bit longer in inflation expectations to make sure that it's anchored. And then for both of the speakers, both of the presenters, I think the discussion on R&G is absolutely on point. I mean, this is so relevant at the moment in the emerging market backdrop. But what I would say is that, in the near term, a reduction of R is easier than an increase in G. I mean, it's just difficult to get your growth rate up notwithstanding base effects, obviously next year, coming out of the 2020 COVID-19 crisis. I'm talking about getting the potential growth rate up because you've actually done reform. We all know that will take some time. But you can start seeing an easing of R if you're able to build up some credibility. And again, I'm going to go back to the credibility. You need desperately to follow through on any of the reform initiatives and the implementation thereof. Now that we can track them, what this economy needs is accountability. And if that's the case, yes, you could get a slight easing on your risk premium. You wouldn't necessarily have to issue more. And the result of that is that you can buy maybe a little bit more time. But what I will also agree with when it comes to Michael's view is that, that said, I can see a crisis on its way. A crisis of some shape and form, because in the end, getting growth up as quickly as South Africa would need to, it seems out of reach in my view. I also don't necessarily believe that it's realistic to do the type of expenditure cuts that are currently being advocated for. Whether they're sensible or not is not the debate. It's whether we have a state that is actually capable thereof. And that's the last point I really want to make here when we think about the wage bill. So we know that wages alone, the wage bill alone is not enough on the expenditure reduction front. We're all on the same page there. But we also know that headcount reduction, even if it's only in the public sector, is also not necessarily the answer because of the tensions and the job loss that we've seen across the economy. But of course, we get back to the credibility and accountability and the effectiveness of government here. Because the one question I would like to know is that if we have so many public workers, why is it that our Minister of Public Administration has just told us that almost 700,000 of those public workers were absent between June and August? Absent from work, whereas only about, I think it's somewhere between 200 and 300,000 of those workers are accounted for as being sick, being ill, being medically unable to work during that period. What have the others been doing? And that is certainly an area government can work on, right? If you can introduce accountability there, then you have every right to fire non-performing workers, much like we should fire non-performing ministers. And obviously, if you have performing public sector workers, well, then we can obviously keep them around. And then there should be incentives in place, because there's no way you can do reform in this economy if you don't have the capabilities within the state. And that does sit in the efficiencies and the effectiveness of our public sector workers. So I'm going to leave it at that in the interest of time. There's lots more to talk about, but just again, a big thank you to everyone for today. I found it very interesting.
Thank you so much, Gina. Gina Skuman is a top-rated local and global analyst. Currently, she is the South African economist and head of research at Citibank, where she's been there for about 8 years. So thanks for those comments, Gina. So what I want to do now is to take the questions that have been posted in our Q&A platform. Firstly, a question for you, Michael, from Jeff Gabriel. What is the way forward then? Surely a debt crisis will generate an even larger impact on all South Africans. Secondly, Eskom's inability to provide power and the huge increase in prices also a factor in South Africa's growth over 3 decades. Let's query the observation that wages and other public service in many cases haven't risen quickly against GDP in the last decade. Doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a problem there. Michael, do you have any comments on the comments and provocation from Jeff Gabriel?
Let's see. What is the way forward? I think that for me, and I mean, maybe we since Jeff as well is a banker, the issue is really what is the way forward tomorrow with the MTBPS? And I suppose, or how do you respond to this as a fiscal policymaker? How should authorities respond? And my view is that they should first of all, they should step back from the targets that they have set themselves, which are impossible to achieve. credibility will be gained by having a more politically grounded approach. So if authorities are able to agree, for instance, with public sector unions on moderate wage increases for the next 3 years, whether you hit your deficit target or not, that will be credit positive, as the bankers like to say. More credit positive than simply sticking to these impossible targets that nobody really believes government is capable of delivering on. So I think there are two issues that we need to apply our minds to. And this is over the medium term, by the way, because I'm of the view that in the current global conditions of hyper easy monetary policy in the US and the UK and Europe, it's quite possible that markets will continue to finance this elevated deficit for some time longer. And I think what we need to address is the structural issues. And as far as fiscal policy is concerned, that means we're going to have to see in the next period large increases in taxation. Even if we raise growth, and I mean that's really the key way forward, is to raise growth, and I'll come back to what I think the options are there. But even if we do raise growth, we're going to be left with this huge debt overhang. And history tells us, and logic tells us, that when you're left with that huge debt overhang, you are going to face large tax increases to manage that. But we will also have to see other elements of South Africa's fiscal compact, and particularly the elements of public consumption, be restructured. So we have a package of things that we deliver at the moment. We are no longer going to be able to deliver the full package. So as far as reviving growth is concerned, and I'm sure that the bankers in the audience and on the panel will agree with me wholeheartedly in this, I think that the only way forward is to revive private investment, because the state of the public sector has been so weakened, and the state of the economy has been so weakened, that effectively government's back is against the wall. And you could put it in the following way. How do you generate private sector investment? Well, the private sector is a very predictable animal. If you are able to guarantee a stream of profit to them over a long enough period of time, they will make the money available up front. They will invest. That will require you to do things that are not going to be popular in the ANC, to make those commitments, for instance, on energy. Guarantee a stream of revenue over a long time, take that onto the balance sheet of the public sector in return for investment. The alternative that we face, the realistic alternative that we face, is to guarantee the private sector an even bigger stream of income over an even longer time in the form of debt service costs, which you then want to raise debt and hand it over to the state, who are going to engage in another set of state-mediated mega projects. Because if you look at the pipeline that is being put together, that's essentially what they're talking about. And I don't think that that will stimulate growth. So I think in the short term, we need to revive the momentum of growth. The only way we can do that is by reviving the momentum of private investment. And that's the position we're in. I'll leave the other ones because I've spoken enough.
Thank you so much. So I've got 3 questions which I want you guys to respond to. 2 from Joe Mavuso and 1 from Olisile Kaiso. So Joe Mavuso asked, number 1, what will be the impact of privatization of SOEs to the growth of the economy? Number 2, what is the practical and logical way out to this stagnant economy of SA? Is IMF borrowing one of the solutions? I think you've hinted on some of the things to do, Michael, but These are the two questions from Joe. From Olisile Kaiso, the first question is, which example of new tools was Ms. Makumata referring to as an example? And for Mr. Sachs, do you mean a free education was a mistake? I don't think so. Maybe let's start with you, Nombulelo.
Mute, yeah, okay. So I think for me, I appreciate what Jeff was saying, and also what Michael is trying to say investment will underpin growth. But what he doesn't appreciate is the fact that there are very huge exchange rate channel contractional effects that underlie the investment the investment channel. It's a pity I couldn't go into those contractional effects. If you're sitting with an exchange rate that has been depreciating for so long, that on its own, the exchange rate channel imposes a very contractional effect on what to import for investment for what, you get that? So those are balance sheet effects that he doesn't bring to the fore in terms of his appreciation of what underlies the investment channel in terms of lifting up growth. Also, I think in our discussions as economists as to what we need to do, we always associate the exchange rate depreciation with the competitiveness approach. If you look at the South African economy, we've never had a period where the exports channel has really driven growth. Instead, what has happened is that the exchange rate channel has driven demand, which has underpinned growth, which is exactly what you don't want if you want to get out of the current problems with the manufacturing sector. So again, I say to us, let us have a proper session where we are going to have a proper discussion of what we mean exactly when we say fiscal policy and monetary policy need to be coordinated, because there's a lot of things that are just not going there. Where I agree with Gina is that there's no fiscal strategy. And a fiscal strategy would underpin a lot of credibility, as opposed to, for instance, now, like I showed you, the mileage that monetary policy has managed to gather in terms of credibility, because now you believe when they say that we are going to achieve an inflation target of so much and this and this and that, you actually believe that they're going to do that. And that is completely missing with fiscal policy. So that's when now coordination becomes critical, precisely because you cannot solve the problem of growth without a monetary policy element. You can also never solve a problem of interest rate, the yield curve, without the central bank. Also, what I thought I was going to say in my presentations was the role of macroprudential tools post-2009, more especially in relation to what demand has been doing. We have underestimated how potent those tools are. And yet we know that pre-2009, they were the major boosters of growth. So I think when you get another session, we can also engage into what has macroprudential tools, and your financial regulatory tools have really stepped on the brakes of demand and investment post-2009. I didn't get the chance of getting into that because of the time. So the question is about the tools. I think in my slide, I present a number of tools, but the issue becomes that when we get into the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank, all of these things come up and they're never contextualized. So for the fear of me being judged as though I'm just throwing the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank and asset purchases out of no context, I would like us to, from Zoo, to really set up a proper session to say what exactly do we mean when we talk about the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank, precisely because the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank is more than asset purchases. You get that? There's your foreign currency reserves accumulations, which we hardly talk about. Just why do we accumulate these reserves? You get that? Why do we do that? Does it contribute to growth? Does it contribute to what exactly? We never talk about that. So on its own, it requires a proper session where we can deal with it. So to cut a long answer short, there are a lot of tools that the central bank can use. It can even create a lot of other tools to deal exactly with the crisis we are facing. It's just that I don't have enough time to explore those. But if you go to my presentation, I did list a few. I think I can stop there.
Thank you, Michael.
I thought I was done, but I would just, since you've given me the floor, agree wholeheartedly with what Nombulelo is saying, that, but make the following addition, which is that I think that macroeconomic policy on both the left, by which I mean Duma, and the right, by which I mean Nombulelo, have been, and that's the point, one of the points I'm trying to make it, have been focused around the cycle and the output gap. And if you accept my thesis, which is that long-term shifts in global conditions determine macroeconomic fundamentals in South Africa, then the implication is that the key issue should not be the output gap, but the real exchange rate. The problem is that if you were going to target the real exchange rate, we definitely then need to talk about the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank. But we need to talk about the combination of balance sheet operations in the Reserve Bank, monetary policy, macro-prudential policy, fiscal policy, and incomes policy, because it's all related to salaries at the end of the day. So, and that, at the moment, I think our macroeconomic institutions are designed so that you cannot have that discussion, because inflation targeting is about the cycle and the output gap. Counter-cyclical fiscal policy, the same. So we're unable to have this important discussion about the real exchange rate, which is really the fundamental issue over time. Of course, right now, we're in a crisis, so I don't know how we respond here.
Thank you, Michael. Kyle Mendy asks Michael, what you're suggesting that we should be increasing tax revenues. Aside from igniting growth, how do you suggest, Michael, that how should that be done, basically? And also, we've seen significant tax increases in recent years on a shrinking tax base. It is readily apparent that such increases on personal income taxes particularly have become self-defeating. Any comment from both speakers? I know Duma and Nombulelo, you've got a right to reply after being labeled as right and left. So I'll give you that chance. But can we respond to this question of Carl and Mendy? Michael, again, and then we'll go back again.
So we face a large shock. And the first point to make is that we need to think about how is that shock distributed, because it's a permanent shock. It's going to be with us for a number of years. So, and if effectively what we have is expenditure, which benefits the poor and the low middle income workers, low income workers, including public servants. And then you have taxes, which are entirely, the burden is on the affluent. So we can't avoid, so the distributional implications of the shock are the first thing. The second thing is that it's just a logical conclusion of this debt accumulation that you will have high taxes. I mean, it's kind of the first thing you learn when you learn about fiscal policy is that the government can fund itself in two ways. The one is taxes today. The second is taxes tomorrow, and that's called borrowing, right? So there are going to be increased taxes to pay off this debt overhang. And I'm not saying it's nice or that it's not going to create problems, other problems for us. It is going to create other problems for us. But you know, the only way you can't address the debt overhang by reducing spending, because that means, like somebody said before, cutting down on basic education, cutting down on healthcare, cutting down on all of the things that you need for people to survive. The only way countries have addressed this debt, this kind of debt overhang in the past, has been some combination of rapid economic growth, high taxes, and what is called compulsory financing. right? Basically forcing people to take the loss. And in our case, since the pension funds are hostage in the domestic economy, are unable to take their reserves out of the country, their wealth out of the country, I think Duma will get what he's after, which is a large devaluation of pension fund wealth in South Africa, not to fund stimulus, but against which the debt will be written off. That's kind of where I see us going. So, again, not nice, but probably going to happen.
Thanks, Michael. So I just want to go to Duma, because Duma, you are being labeled, but also you might be taking us to a road to nowhere, according to what Michael is saying, if I understood him very, very well. Can you, Donna, comment and respond to those comments? Also the balance sheet issue, which Nombulelo raised, whether you'll be available for us to engage further, given that you also put it onto the agenda this afternoon. Duma? Unmute yourself, Duma.
About the wage bill, I've got good relations with the unions. I can guarantee you that, Gina, if you cancel the 37 billion for this year and reward them their wage increase, we can have in line with inflation increases over the next 3 years. So that's the kind of political agreement. I can't remember the words that Mike used, but if there were proper facilitators, we could have a credible, was it you? One of you said a credible agreement with labor that takes into account political constraints. So I just wanted to ask, I think Nombulelo and Mike, sorry man, I'm not, Mike said R is not within our control, but one issue that was talked about in previous papers in the, by Andrew Donaldson, that we could have like more aggressive purchases of debt on the secondary market. Number one. Number two, if you read the latest IMF Global Stability Report, a lot of 18 emerging markets got involved in QE and monetary financing. Can't we be more aggressive, Nombulelo, in terms of, the central bank and the PIC coming to the party in terms of financing the government debt in the short term? And then thirdly, also influencing the gap between long and short interest rates. Can't we have a more active policy from the Reserve Bank? And then Mike, on the real exchange rate, I stopped talking about this because middle-class South Africans, they're just so obsessed with their petrol price and they just don't get it, But I agree with you, we need to target the real exchange rate, but I stopped talking about it because when I'm sitting with my friends, my petrol price, Thank you.
Thanks, Duma. Nombulelo, and then I'll have two questions and then I want Gina to comment on. Thank you. Nombulelo?
Yeah, no, you see, it again goes back to the compartmentalization that I talked about. The central bank balance sheet is beyond large-scale asset purchases. For instance, if you were to buy government bonds, that on its own has an impact on the yield. You decide where you want to concentrate on the yield curve, and then you flatten the yield curve, isn't it? But also, it also has exchange rate effects in the sense that you are creating a shortage in terms of government bonds. That on its own feeds into the exchange rate channel. So these are a number of channels that are going to be active. So that's why I'm saying to you that I really plead with Mzu that he can clearly set up a session where we can deal with the exchange rate channel. Also, if you go to the reserves accumulation as part of a tool of a central bank, it works via the exchange rate channel and yields, you see? So that on its own, it tells you that these are interacting tools that are on this balance sheet of one institution, and also presents an opportunity to say, if you are going to accumulate these reserves, how are you going to manage them? Then that's how the PIC comes into place. It's an asset manager. You have these reserves that you cannot keep on your balance sheet for precautionary purposes, and also earning a very low yield in terms of international rates. So you need to be able to say, what strategy am I going to do am I going to adopt to manage this central bank balance sheet tools? Also now, if we are talking about the deposit, the deposit scheme, You could also look at the balance sheet of the bank, because if you were to use the accommodation window, which is now priced at the repo rate, and also adopt a dual interest rate approach to the balance sheet, to the repo rate market, it changes the picture of how banks fund themselves, you see? And that is also a balance sheet tool on the Reserve Bank's balance sheet. So it goes beyond just the large scale asset purchases. And I think in the talk we've been having for the past, since last year, we have been so obsessed about QE and all of that, and how we manage the excess reserves and all of that, and not putting into context that all of these things are interconnected, and they also impact on the fiscal sustainability.
Thanks so much, Nombulelo. So Gina, it's your turn.
Yes, I just wanted to add in, again, I think what we're speaking about here is all very relevant, and it's a trend we're seeing across emerging markets. It's just depending on what type of path you go down. But the question I think you still have to ask yourself is, to what end? It's absolutely fine to use a central bank's balance sheet, but the question is, to what end? Do you have conviction that reforms will occur in South Africa and that growth will come back? Because I think that's the end part of all of this. I think any central bank would happily step up and assist with new types of monetary policy instruments and be more accommodative if they trusted the system. In other words, if they were certain that we were actually going to see more growth going forward. And I totally agree. We have an incredibly deep asset base that South Africa can work with. But believe me, the owners of those assets would only be happy to participate if, again, they were assured that there was going to be some type of step change to South Africa's growth potential going forward. And I'm just going to quickly share one graph with all of you. See if I can find it quickly. There we go. Can you all see this? I don't know if you can. There we go. This is, Duma mentioned it. If you have a look at the IMF's Global Stability Financial Report, you'll see on figure 2.9 in the emerging markets section, you'll see South Africa's domestic institutional investor base right over here versus the other emerging markets. So you can see how deep our investor base actually is. And this makes sense why everyone's starting to talk about, having a look at this as a way to help government, as a way to potentially look at assisting, the fiscal path forward. But again, I want to stress that that path only works seamlessly if there is a belief, if there is some kind of conviction that you're going to get growth stronger.
Thank you, Gina. So I have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask each and every one of you, maybe give 2 minutes to our writers, authors of the papers, but also just a minute each from my respondents. Apologies. So can you please talk to, as you respond to the last comment, to whether SOEs can be reformed? If they are reformed, will they spur growth? And lastly, what about public-private partnerships? Thank you. I'll start with Nombulelo and then Michael, and then Gina, and then Tuma. Thank you.
And you said 2 minutes. 2 minutes only. Yeah, so for me, really, as I said, I really request Mzu to set up another forum where we can clearly talk about coordination. And as Gina says, growth. And what we know now is that you're not going to achieve growth without coordinating policies across spheres of government. And what we also know as well, you are not going to achieve growth without having a concerted effort to achieve growth, similarly with unemployment. So what I'm trying to say is that if you remember, we had this same debate about the inflation targeting regime, where we said, oh no, you'll never achieve a low inflation, all of those things. Look where we are. So what I'm saying is that let's come up and agree that growth comes first, unemployment has to come down. Let us meet and come up with a a coordinated effort. And let's agree that it's not a one size fits all. All sectors are different. What needs to be done for the agricultural sector differs from transport, manufacturing, and all of that. So that is my last parting shot. Let me give other people a chance.
Michael?
So the last two slides that I neglected to, I didn't get to, were all about this issue of quantitative easing and the emerging markets. And so I wanted to just make 2 points about that. The first is, and I think this is where I disagree with a lot of the proponents of further quantitative easing, is I think they neglect to take account of the fact that there's something called an international monetary system. And it is not a fair system. It is asymmetric. And it defines sovereigns differently. So that's the first thing. And what I'm saying about that is that just because the US and the UK, the policy environment in South Africa is fundamentally different from what it is in countries that can issue reserve currencies, number one. Number two, it's true that emerging markets, other emerging markets, Indonesia, the Philippines, etc., have engaged in wide-ranging quantitative easing bond purchasing programs in the current environment. And there's 2 points to make about that. The first is that the current environment is wholly supportive through ultra easy interest rates and quantitative easings in vast quantities in the core economies in the world, in the US, Japan, and Europe. So while those conditions last, emerging markets can do so. If those conditions change, then we'll see where we are, number one. Number two, of all of those emerging markets that are engaging in quantitative easing, South Africa is the only one with a fundamentally unsustainable fiscal position. So if you look at Indonesian debt has fallen year after year for the last 20 years. Same for the Philippines, right? Those countries that have sustainability issues such as Brazil have not been engaging in more quantitative easing than us, because there's something fundamentally wrong with going to the market and saying, we're going to prop up the value of this asset when, as Gina says, growth is collapsing and not going anywhere. And there are other safer assets available. So I think that this is, the Reserve Bank can intervene much more than it has already, in my view, to offset the fluctuations and ease the conditions we face. But it cannot resolve the underlying fiscal imbalance. That can only be resolved through real economic acceleration.
Thanks, Michael.
You see that I don't want to come in and just cut off from Mike saying QE. That's exactly why I'm saying that. Let us have a proper session. Then Michael will understand what does large-scale asset purchases involve. Because let me just give you an example. The Reserve Bank buys government bonds. It creates a shortage. You get that? Of these bonds. That's the effects work via yields and the exchange rate, and they also do what is financing conditions. It's the same approach you would have taken if you're accumulating reserves, you see. So what we need to do is to have a common understanding of what we are talking about. As Gina says, what are we trying to achieve? Because all of these things work on financial conditions, and where do financial conditions end up? In loosening the financing constraint of government, households, and firms, you see? So we are not disagreeing. It's just that now what we tend to get lost in is to say QE, large-scale asset purchases, this and that and that. And also, I just wanted to bring Michael's attention to one thing. If global conditions are so important and are going to fundamentally change, can he just pay attention to the fact that we have been in this situation since 2007, where the global interest rates have been moving between 0 and 1, 0 and 1, over and above balance sheet activities of central banks. So if he's trying to say things are going to change in the next 3, 4, 5 years, I disagree with him completely. The nature of monetary policy has changed completely. Look at Europe, how they solve their own financial government position, a financial crisis after the 2007 crisis. So that's why I'm saying I don't want us to rush this debate because it's important. It's one of the most fundamental debates we need to have. And I beg Mzu to really have a session on this one, and then we can thresh it out properly without rushing.
Thanks, Mamule. The point has been made. Gina, parting short, no one talks about SOEs. Anything you want to say? And then over to you, Tuma, after that.
I think the parting note on SOEs is pretty simple. If any state-owned enterprise or any enterprise is run inefficiently, at a loss, ineffectively, then yes, if you can get someone else to come and help out and assist, then naturally it's going to be less of a cost to the economy. You know, I cannot even begin to describe, and I do agree with Jeff Gable was on the Q&A earlier, you know, how much of a Achilles heel Eskom, but yes, I agree with Michael, other SOEs have also been to this economy from both a cost inflation perspective, but also a growth perspective. So, you know, we've got many areas that need fixing, but I think if we just get started, you'd be surprised by how much time that can still buy us.
Okay,
thank you so much, Gina. Tuma?
Yeah, my parting comment is that, you know, someone asked about PPPs. If you look at the last 20 years, the smallest portion of public investment is PPEs. I think it's averaged about 2% of public investment. So if they fail so dismally over 20 years, and there's a number about how much they've contributed to investment in the latest PEAC report, I think it's about 100 billion. That is a small amount over such a long period. So I'm not optimistic about, or the other thing I want to say is that I'm not optimistic about stimulating private investment in the absence of higher GDP growth. And I don't think it can happen through the blending things that the government is talking about, which haven't looked at the international experience of blending and public and private expertise. And then finally, I just want to say that as with Nombule, I agree with her, with my colleague on the right, that the conditions that she's talking about are going to last for 10 years. I mean, we're talking about 2030, just to be conservative. They're going to be with us for a very long time. And I just want to read from the Global Stability Report. They say domestic asset purchases lowered bond yields and had little effect on currencies. So I want to understand, how does how does it affect in the next session the exchange rate channel? That's what I'm trying to say, because all the evidence that we've seen is that it had little effect on the currencies. Yeah, but anyway. But I agree that it doesn't mean that it will be the same for us because of the stuff that Mike is talking about. And I agree that monetary policy can't sort out the structural problems in terms of our debt here.
Thank you so much to the authors and thank you so much to respondents and panelists. So now I'm going to hand over to Professor Obo to thank you formally, and then we can close. But also, I forgot to mention and thank also the participants who've been wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. Thanks, Lumgele, for wonderful chairing and our panelists. This has been really insightful discussions. As I said in the comment section, it's not definitive. There are certainly those areas would need to pick up and discussed in a very focused format, as Nombulelo kept on repeating. So I hope Nomfundo was paying attention to the pressure, because she leads this process, and certainly we as a team behind these discussions, we're going to look at how we program further discussions, and possibly with people who take decisions, the policymakers themselves. I think it'd be wonderful to have them in the room on some of these questions around macroeconomic coordination, the effects of exchange rates, the weight that the external environment has on the domestic front, as well as the very, very, very important question that Gina raised on policy credibility. So with those words, I really would like to thank our panelists and our participants. We'll inform you of the next scheduled webinars on various themes that are produced under the theme South Africa's Future Economy, which is supported by Telkom. Thank you.